The lights cut out before anyone told us why. I remember gripping the armrest of my seat so hard that my claws left marks in the metal. Around me, 60 new cadets sat in the dark, and not one of us made a sound. We had been told this day would be different. We had not been told how different. My name is Voss Taryn, and I was 17 days into training at the Combined Forces Academy when they marched us into that black room and locked the doors behind us. A single screen lit up at the front, throwing pale light across rows of frightened faces. Every species in the Alliance was represented in that room. Thaxians with their plated skin gone gray with nerves. Corps cadets, usually loud, now perfectly silent. A pair of Ilvena twins, holding hands so tightly their fingers had turned a deeper shade of blue. And somewhere near the back, slouched low in a chair built for a body twice his size, sat the only human in our class. I did not know his name yet. I only knew that humans were rare in this program. Their homeworld had joined the Alliance only a few years earlier, and most of them stayed close to their own training centers, on their own ships, with their own instructors. Having one here, with us, felt like a strange kind of honor and a strange kind of warning at the same time. The screen flickered once. Then a voice spoke, calm and flat, the kind of voice that has delivered bad news so many times it has stopped feeling anything about it. What you are about to see is real. This is not simulation. This is not training data. These are recordings taken during actual combat operations across Alliance history. You will watch in silence. You will not look away. Nobody moved. I had heard about this moment from cadets 2 years ahead of me. They called it the breaking room. They said it was the point where the academy decided who actually belonged here and who needed to be quietly removed before they got someone killed. Some cadets, I had been told, never came back to class after this day. They transferred out, they went home. Nobody blamed them for it. I did not want to be one of those cadets. I had wanted this since I was young enough to still believe that wanting something hard enough was the same as being ready for it. The footage began. It opened on a ship interior, lights flashing red, alarms screaming somewhere in the background audio. The camera, mounted to someone's armor, shook violently as its owner ran down a corridor. Then the corridor buckled. The metal screamed louder than the alarms. A body, 3 rows ahead of me, jerked backward so hard the chair creaked. I kept my eyes on the screen because I had been told not to look away, and because some old animal part of my brain was convinced that looking away would somehow be worse, would somehow make whatever happened next happen to me instead of to the figures in the recording. The footage cut to another scene, a planet's surface, dust thick enough to swallow the horizon, weapons fire crossing the frame in long orange lines. Someone screamed in a language I did not recognize, and the scream did not stop when the audio cut to black for half a second before resuming on a different angle. Beside me, a Thaxian cadet named Orun Vex had stopped breathing in any rhythm I could follow. His plates had gone fully gray now, drained of color the way his species does when fear takes over completely. On my other side, a Corps cadet was making a low sound in her throat, something between a growl and a whimper, her claws dug so deep into her own knee that I worried she would draw blood through the fabric of her uniform. The footage did not slow down. It moved from one disaster to the next, with no warning, no transition, no mercy. A ship breaking apart in open space, debris and bodies tumbling together in silence, because there was no air left to carry sound. A medical bay overwhelmed, more wounded arriving than there were hands to help them. A final transmission from a commander, whose voice cracked halfway through a sentence she never finished. I felt my own hands shaking. I pressed them flat against my legs to stop it, the way my mother used to do when she was nervous before something important. And for one strange moment, in the middle of all that horror, I thought about her instead, about her hands flat on the kitchen table back home, about how strange it was that fear made you remember small things instead of the big ones. Around me, the room had become something close to chaos, held perfectly still. Nobody screamed, nobody ran. The doors were locked, and we all knew it, so the only thing left to do was sit there and let the footage do whatever it was designed to do to us. That was when I first noticed him. I do not know what made me look. Maybe it was the wrongness of it, some instinct picking up on something that did not match the rest of the room before my conscious mind understood what it was seeing. I turned my head, just slightly, just enough to catch the back row in the corner of my vision. The human cadet was eating something. It looked like a small wrapped bar, the kind of plain ration food I had seen humans carry in their kits during orientation week. He had it half unwrapped in one hand, and he was peeling the rest of the wrapper back with the kind of mild irritation a person shows when a package does not open the way it is supposed to. On the screen in front of all of us, a building was collapsing on a screaming crowd. He took a bite of his bar. I stared at him longer than I should have, long enough that I nearly missed the next part of the footage entirely, and in that staring I felt something shift inside my chest that was not exactly fear anymore. It was confusion, sharp and sudden, the kind that arrives uninvited and refuses to leave. Every other person in that room was being taken apart by what we were watching. The footage was doing exactly what it was built to do. It was showing us, in the clearest possible terms, what waited for us if we failed, if we hesitated, if we made the wrong choice at the wrong second during the wrong mission years from now. And this human, this one single cadet out of 60, looked like he was waiting for a bus. He was not frozen. He was not pale. His breathing had not changed in any way I could detect. He simply sat there, chewing slowly, watching the screen with an expression that I can only describe as mild attention, the same look you might give a weather report for a city you do not live in. I wanted to believe he was simply better trained than the rest of us, that humans went through something so extreme in their own programs that this was nothing to him by comparison, some easy warm-up before the real test began. That explanation would have made sense. It would have fit neatly into everything I had been told about humans being unusually difficult to frighten on the battlefield, stories I had assumed were exaggerated the way most stories about new alliance members tend to be exaggerated at first. But there was another part of me, a smaller and colder part, that wondered if something else was happening instead. I wondered if he simply did not understand what he was looking at. I wondered if some translation gap, some cultural difference too large to bridge in a few short years of alliance membership, meant that the horror in front of him simply was not registering as horror at all. Whatever the reason, he kept eating his bar. The footage continued for what felt like much longer than it probably was. More collapses, more screaming, a final sequence showing the aftermath of some battle whose name I never learned, rows of covered bodies stretching further than the camera could properly capture, medics moving between them with the slow, defeated walk of people who already know there is nothing left to save. Then, finally, the screen went dark. The lights came up slowly, the way they do in a room designed to ease people back into reality rather than shock them with sudden brightness. Around me, cadets were wiping their eyes, gripping the arms of their chairs, breathing in slow, deliberate patterns the way we had been taught to do when our bodies needed to recover from something extreme. Orun Vex had not regained his color. The Corps cadet beside me had 4 small cuts in her own knee, where her claws had broken through the fabric of her uniform. I turned around fully this time, no longer trying to hide that I was looking. The human had finished his bar. He was folding the wrapper into a small, neat square, the kind of automatic habit a person does without thinking, the kind of habit that exists entirely outside of whatever else is happening in the room around them. He noticed me looking and gave a small nod, friendly, almost polite, the way you might nod at a stranger you pass in a hallway. I did not nod back. I could not. My mouth had gone dry and my mind was working through a single question over and over, refusing to let go of it, even as the instructor at the front of the room began speaking again about what we had just witnessed and what it meant for our training going forward. The question was simple, and it would not leave me alone for the rest of that day, or the day after, or for a long time after that. What kind of person watches something like that and finishes their snack? I did not know his name yet. I did not know anything about him beyond the fact that he existed in that room with the rest of us, breathing the same recycled air, sitting through the same footage, and somehow walking away from it completely untouched, while the rest of us walked away changed. But I knew. with a certainty that settled into my chest like a stone dropping into still water, that I was going to find out exactly what made him different. I just did not yet understand how much that answer would change everything I thought I knew about fear, about humans, and about what the Alliance had actually invited into its ranks when it opened its doors to a species none of us truly understood. I caught him 3 days later in the mess hall, sitting alone at the end of a long table, eating something gray and unappetizing from a metal tray. I had spent those 3 days asking quiet questions to anyone who might know something about him. Most cadets knew nothing beyond his name, which I had finally learned was Dale Whitmore, and the basic fact that he came from a continent on Earth called North America, a detail that meant nothing to me but seemed to matter to him when he mentioned it once during a class introduction. Nobody had a good explanation for what I had witnessed in that screening room. A Corps cadet named Pell Adrenis told me she thought humans simply lacked proper emotional wiring, that something about their biology made them unable to process distress the way the rest of us did. An Ilvena cadet disagreed, insisting that humans felt everything just as deeply as anyone else, but had simply learned to hide it better than any species in known space. I did not believe either explanation, though I could not yet say why. I sat down across from Dale without asking permission, which I understood later was considered slightly rude in human culture, though he did not seem to mind. "You're the one who kept staring at me," he said, not looking up from his tray, "during the screening." My stomach tightened with something close to embarrassment. I was not staring. "You were absolutely staring." He finally looked up, and his expression held no anger in it, only a kind of easy amusement that I found difficult to read. "It's fine. People stare at me a lot here. I'm used to it. I wanted to ask you something," I said, deciding there was no point pretending otherwise. "About the screening." "Figured as much." He pushed a piece of the gray substance around his tray with a fork. "Go ahead." I struggled to find the right words, turning the question over in my mind several times before I finally let it out. "Did you understand what we were watching?" Something shifted in his face, subtle but unmistakable, like a door opening just a crack before being pulled shut again. "I understood it fine." "Then how were you so calm?" He set his fork down and leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that made me feel like I was the one being examined now, rather than the other way around. "What makes you think I was calm?" "You were eating a ration bar," I said. "While buildings collapsed on screaming people, you folded the wrapper into a square afterward." A short laugh escaped him, though it carried no real humor in it. "You noticed the wrapper thing too." "That's specific." "I notice things," I said, feeling slightly defensive without entirely understanding why. "I am trying to understand. Everyone else in that room was destroyed by what we saw. You looked like you were waiting for transport." Dale was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I began to wonder if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier ease. "Where I'm from," he said slowly, "footage like that gets shown to kids before they're old enough to vote. It gets shown on news programs during dinner. It gets shown in documentaries that win awards. We don't lock people in dark rooms to make them watch it for the first time as adults. We grow up already having seen worse, in pieces, spread out over years, until it stops being something new and starts being something familiar." I tried to imagine what kind of childhood produced a person capable of saying something like that without flinching, and found that I could not. "That sounds terrible," I said, before I could stop myself. "It is terrible," he agreed, without hesitation. "Doesn't mean it isn't true." I wanted to push further, to ask exactly what kind of history his species carried that could create this strange combination of awareness and distance. But something in his expression told me the conversation had reached a wall, at least for that day. Instead, I asked a smaller question, one that had been sitting underneath the larger one since the moment I first saw him reach for that bar. "Were you not afraid, even a little?" He considered this with more care than I expected. "Fear's not really the right word for what I was doing in there." "Then what is the right word?" "Cataloging," he said, "filing things away. That's not the same as not feeling anything. It's just a different way of carrying it." I did not fully understand what he meant by that, not then, though I would come to understand it much better in the months that followed. Word about our conversation spread through the cadet barracks faster than I expected, twisted slightly with each retelling the way rumors always are. By the following week, half the class believed Dale had told me humans felt no fear at all, an idea that several cadets seemed to find both impressive and deeply unsettling at the same time. A Thaxian cadet named Corin Ash approached me one evening in the training yard, his plated skin still carrying a faint gray tint that had not fully returned to its normal color since the screening, even days later. "Is it true," he asked, "that the human felt nothing?" "That is not what he told me," I said carefully, aware that I was now somehow responsible for representing a conversation I barely understood myself. "Then what did he tell you?" I tried to explain the concept of cataloging as best I could, though I struggled to make it sound like anything other than a clever excuse for something stranger underneath. Corin listened with the particular intensity that Thaxians bring to anything they consider a potential threat, his plates shifting in small movements as he processed what I was saying. "It does not matter what he calls it," Corin finally said. "If he does not feel fear the way we do, he should not be trusted with the same missions we are trained for. Fear keeps soldiers careful. Without it, a person becomes reckless, or worse." I had not considered this angle before, and it sat uncomfortably in my mind for the rest of that evening. I had been so focused on understanding what made Dale different that I had not stopped to consider whether that difference might be dangerous, both to himself and to anyone fighting alongside him. That night, unable to sleep, I pulled up the small amount of public information available about Earth's recent military history, curious to understand exactly what Dale had meant about footage shown to children before they could vote. What I found unsettled me more than I expected. Earth's history, even in the relatively small window of information available to Alliance researchers, was filled with conflicts on a scale that seemed almost impossible for a species that had only achieved unified spaceflight within the last several decades. Wars that lasted years. Wars that lasted generations. Records of violence stretching back further than most other Alliance species kept detailed history at all. I began to understand, slowly and with a growing discomfort, that humans had not joined the Alliance as innocent newcomers stepping carefully into a dangerous galaxy for the first time. They had joined as a species that had already spent its entire recorded history learning, the hardest possible way, exactly what conflict cost, and exactly how to survive it anyway. The footage that had broken half our class had perhaps been, to Dale, simply another data point in a long line of similar data points, filed away alongside thousands of others he had absorbed before he ever set foot on this academy. That explanation made sense in my mind, logically, in the careful way I tried to make sense of difficult things. But understanding something logically and feeling comfortable with it were two very different experiences, and I found myself unable to fully settle into the second one. The following week brought our first physical combat simulation, a controlled exercise meant to test basic reaction times and decision-making under moderate stress. Cadets were paired off randomly, given simple scenarios, and observed by instructors who recorded everything for later review. I was paired with Pel Adranus, the core cadet who had told me her theory about human emotional wiring. Our scenario was simple enough, a mock rescue exercise inside a darkened training structure designed to simulate a damaged ship corridor, complete with sound effects meant to mimic structural failure and distant alarms. Dale was paired with Corin Ash, 2 rows down from us, given a similar scenario in a separate section of the structure. I performed my exercise adequately, though my hands shook slightly during the simulated alarm sequence, a small failure that I knew would appear in my evaluation notes. Pel performed better than me, moving through the corridor with the steady confidence that came naturally to her species during physical tasks. When our group reassembled afterward to review results, the instructor pulled up Dale's footage alongside everyone else's, and the entire room went quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet of the screening room days earlier. Dale had completed the exercise in less than half the expected time. His movement through the simulated corridor showed none of the hesitation that marked nearly every other cadet's footage, including my own. When the simulated structural failure triggered partway through his run, sending a section of false ceiling crashing down directly in his projected path, Dale had adjusted his route a full second before the collapse even began. "How?" the instructor asked, genuine surprise breaking through her usually flat delivery. "Did you anticipate that collapse before it happened?" Dale shrugged, the same easy gesture I had already come to associate with him. Sound changed. Structural groan gets higher pitched right before something gives. You learn to listen for it. Where would you have learned that? For the first time since I had met him, Dale hesitated before answering, something passing behind his eyes that looked almost like reluctance. "Home," he said simply, and offered nothing further. The instructor did not push him on it, though I noticed her making a note in her tablet that she did not share with the rest of the class. I filed that detail away, the same way Dale himself might have, uncertain what it meant, but certain that it mattered. As the weeks continued, a pattern began to emerge that I could not ignore no matter how hard I tried to explain it away. In every exercise, every simulation, every scenario designed to test our reactions under controlled fear, Dale consistently performed at a level the rest of us struggled to reach, even after months of dedicated training. It was not that he lacked fear entirely, I came to realize, watching him more closely than I probably should have over those weeks. There were small signs, if you knew where to look, a slight tightening around his eyes during certain types of audio cues, a particular stillness that came over him whenever an exercise involved enclosed spaces with limited exit routes. These were not the reactions of someone incapable of fear. They were the reactions of someone who had learned, somewhere in a childhood I still knew almost nothing about, exactly how to keep functioning while afraid, rather than being stopped by it the way the rest of us so often were. I began to suspect that the calm I had witnessed in the screening room was not the absence of fear at all. It was something far more disciplined, and in its own way, far more unsettling. It was fear that had been trained, for years, to stay quiet and let the work get done anyway. That realization sat with me through the rest of that training cycle, growing heavier each time I watched Dale move through another exercise with the same unbothered ease, the same folded wrapper, the same small nod toward anyone who happened to be staring. I did not yet know that the true test of what made him different was still ahead of us, waiting in a part of the program none of us had been told about yet, a part that would force every assumption I had built about humans, about fear, and about Dale Whitmore specifically, to break apart entirely. 6 weeks into our training cycle, the Academy announced a joint field exercise unlike anything we had attempted before, one that would place cadets aboard a retired naval vessel for a full week of live simulation in actual zero-gravity conditions. The ship was called the Calder's Hope, an old transport vessel stripped of its weapons systems decades earlier and repurposed entirely for training. Even decommissioned, it was an enormous structure, large enough to house several hundred cadets across multiple decks, with corridors long enough that you could lose sight of another person within seconds of them turning a corner. I had never been aboard a ship that size before, and the scale of it left me unsteady for the first several hours after boarding, my inner sense of direction struggling to adjust to corridors that curved in ways my body had not evolved to understand. Dale, by contrast, moved through the ship as though he had memorized its layout before ever setting foot inside, navigating turns and junctions with a confidence that drew curious glances from cadets and instructors alike. "You've been on ships like this before," I said, catching up to him during a brief rest period on our second day aboard. "Couple times," he admitted. "Training exercises back home use similar layouts. Old habit, I guess." Our group had been assigned to a section of the ship designated for mid-level cadets, tasked with a series of escalating exercises meant to simulate increasingly severe emergency scenarios. The first few days passed without serious incident. Small fires to contain, simulated hull breaches to patch, minor medical emergencies to triage under time pressure. Then, on the 4th day, something went wrong that was not part of the simulation at all. I was in the lower cargo section with Pellegrinus and 3 other cadets, running through a routine inventory exercise when the ship's lighting flickered once, twice, and then failed entirely, plunging the entire corridor into total darkness. For a moment, nobody moved, all of us assuming this was simply the next stage of our scheduled exercise, another scenario designed to test our composure. Then the alarms began, and they did not sound like the alarms we had been trained on. These alarms carried a different pitch, sharper, more urgent, accompanied by a deep groaning sound that seemed to travel through the metal floor itself, rather than through the air. I felt the vibration of it in my feet before I consciously registered what it meant. "That is not a training alarm," Pell said, her voice tight in the darkness. A voice crackled over the ship's intercom system a moment later, an instructor's voice, but stripped of the calm professional tone we had grown used to. "All cadets, this is not part of scheduled exercise. Repeat, this is not part of scheduled exercise. We have experienced a containment failure in the secondary power core. All personnel proceed immediately to designated emergency stations." The lights flickered back on at perhaps a quarter of their normal brightness, casting the corridor in a dim red emergency glow that made every shadow look deeper than it should have been. I felt my chest tighten in a way that no simulation had ever produced in me before, a cold and immediate recognition that whatever was happening now was real in a way nothing else during this exercise had been. "The emergency stations are 2 decks up," I said, my voice coming out thinner than I wanted it to. "We need to move." We started moving as a group, through the dim corridor, following the emergency lighting strips embedded along the floor, but within a few dozen meters we found our path blocked entirely. A section of ceiling had partially collapsed ahead of us, not from any simulation, but from actual structural stress, debris and twisted support beams forming a barrier across the corridor that none of us could safely climb through. "There has to be another route," one of the other cadets said, his voice cracking with a fear I recognized immediately because I felt the same thing building in my own chest. We turned back the way we came, only to find that the corridor behind us had begun filling with a thin haze of smoke, drifting in from somewhere further down the ship, carrying with it a faint acrid smell that made my throat tighten with every breath. Panic, real panic, the kind no training simulation had ever fully prepared me for, began spreading through our small group with the speed of something contagious. Pell's claws were extended fully now, an instinctive reaction her species could not suppress even when she clearly knew it would not help our situation. Another cadet had pressed himself flat against the wall, breathing in short, rapid bursts that I worried would eventually overwhelm him entirely. I tried to think, tried to remember any of the emergency protocols we had been taught during our first weeks of training, but my mind kept circling back to the same useless thought over and over, a kind of mental loop that refused to let me focus on anything productive. We were trapped between a blocked path forward and spreading smoke behind us, on a ship far larger than any of us fully understood, with no clear way to reach the safety the intercom voice had promised was waiting for us if we could only find it. That was when Dale appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving through the thin haze of smoke with a steadiness that seemed almost impossible given everything happening around him. "Everyone still breathing okay?" he called out, his voice carrying clearly, despite the noise of distant alarms and groaning metal. "The path is blocked both ways," I said, fighting to keep my own voice steady. "We cannot reach the emergency station." Dale moved closer, taking in the collapsed section of ceiling with a quick, assessing glance, before turning his attention to the increasing smoke behind us. "Okay, new plan. There's a maintenance shaft about 15 meters back, behind that smoke. It connects to the upper decks through a route the emergency stations don't usually use, but it'll get us clear of this section." "How do you know that?" Pell demanded, her voice sharp with the particular aggression her species sometimes displayed when frightened. "Studied the ship's schematics before we boarded," Dale said simply. "Figured it was worth knowing more than one way out of anywhere I'm sleeping for a week." There was no time to question the wisdom of this preparation, only time to follow him as he led our small group back through the thickening smoke toward a narrow maintenance hatch, set low into the corridor wall. Easy to miss, unless you already knew exactly where to look for it. The hatch was small, barely wide enough for one person to pass through at a time, and the shaft beyond it climbed upward at a steep angle into darkness that our handheld lights barely penetrated. "I will go first," I said, surprising myself with the offer, though some part of me understood that if I hesitated even a moment longer, my fear would take the decision away from me entirely. "Good plan," Dale said, and there was something in his tone, some quiet approval, that steadied me more than I expected it to. I climbed into the shaft, the metal rungs cold and slightly slick beneath my hands, my breathing loud in my own ears as I forced myself upward one careful movement at a time. Behind me, I could hear the others following, Pell's claws occasionally scraping against the metal walls as she climbed, the labored breathing of the cadet, who had been struggling most with his panic. Dale came last, and even through my own fear I noticed that he paused at the base of the shaft slightly longer than necessary, glancing back the way we had come, before finally climbing in and sealing the hatch behind him. "What were you looking at?" I called down, my voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. "Making sure nobody else needed this way out," he said, his voice tight in a way I had not heard from him before. Not since the day I first watched him eat his ration bar through an entire screening of combat footage without flinching. We climbed in silence after that, each of us focused entirely on the simple, exhausting work of moving upward through a space too narrow for comfort, too dark for confidence, too uncertain for anything except continued effort. The shaft eventually opened into a small maintenance room on an upper deck, considerably brighter than the corridor we had escaped, with proper emergency lighting and, more importantly, breathable air free of the smoke that had been chasing us below. The moment we emerged, the cadet who had been struggling with his breathing finally broke down entirely, sliding down against the wall and pressing his hands over his face, his whole body shaking with the release of fear he had been holding back during the climb. Pell knelt beside him immediately, speaking in low, steady tones, the kind of comfort I had not expected from someone who had seemed so aggressive only minutes earlier. I found myself looking instead at Dale, who had moved to a small console mounted on the wall and was already working to re-establish contact with the ship's main systems, his fingers moving across the interface with the same calm focus he had shown in every exercise since the start of our training cycle. "Are you afraid right now?" I asked him quietly, the question slipping out before I could decide whether it was appropriate to ask. He did not look up from the console immediately, continuing his work for several more seconds before finally answering. "Yeah, pretty scared, actually." The honesty of it surprised me more than any calm response could have. "You do not look it. Looking scared doesn't help anyone climb a ladder faster," he said, finally glancing toward me. "Feeling it and showing it are two different things. I feel it plenty. I just learned a long time ago that showing it doesn't get anyone home safer." Before I could respond, the console under his hands crackled to life, and the instructor's voice returned, considerably calmer now than it had been during the initial alarm. "All cadets, this is an updated status report. The containment failure has been brought under control. No actual casualties have occurred. I repeat, this situation, while unplanned, did not result in any serious injuries. All groups, please report your positions for accountability." The relief that swept through the small room was immediate and overwhelming, the cadet who had broken down earlier letting out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, Pell finally retracting her claws fully for the first time since the alarms had begun. I felt my own legs go weak with the sudden release of tension, and I had to lean against the wall to keep myself steady. Dale reported our position calmly into the console, providing exact details about our location and the route we had taken to reach it, his voice carrying none of the relief the rest of us were openly displaying, though I noticed his hand was not entirely steady as he keyed in the final transmission. It was only later, once instructors had arrived to escort us properly back to the main living quarters, that I learned the full truth of what had happened. The containment failure had been real, an actual mechanical fault in aging equipment never fully decommissioned despite the ship's training status. It had not been life-threatening in the end, contained well before it reached any critical threshold, but for the several minutes our group had spent trapped in that corridor, none of us had known that, and none of the instructors monitoring the situation had known it either. What I also learned, through quiet conversation among the instructors that I was not technically supposed to overhear, was that Dale had not simply happened to know about the maintenance shaft by coincidence. He had memorized 3 separate emergency routes through that section of the ship during his very first night aboard, well before any exercises had begun, entirely on his own initiative, without being asked to do so by anyone. "Why would you do that?" I asked him later that evening, once we had both returned to our assigned quarters, and the adrenaline of the day had finally begun to fade. "Memorize routes nobody told you to memorize." Dale was quiet for a moment, sitting on the edge of his bunk with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, looking more tired than I had ever seen him look before. "Where I'm from," he said eventually, "you don't wait for someone to tell you the building might catch on fire before you learn where the exits are. You just assume it might happen, and you prepare for it anyway, because waiting until you need the information is usually too late to learn it." "That sounds exhausting," I said honestly. "It is," he agreed. "But it's also why we made it out of that corridor today, instead of standing there waiting for someone else to figure out a plan." I thought about Corin Ash's concern from weeks earlier, his worry that a person without normal fear responses could not be trusted in dangerous situations. Watching Dale now, exhausted and honest about his own fear in a way he had never been before, I understood for the first time how wrong that concern had been. Dale was not fearless. He had simply learned, through a history I still did not fully understand, exactly how to carry his fear without letting it carry him instead. The rest of the cadets in our group, I would learn over the following days, began treating Dale with a new kind of respect after that incident, one that went beyond simple curiosity about his species and settled instead into something closer to genuine trust. But for me, the change ran deeper than that. I no longer saw him as a strange curiosity to study and explain. I saw him instead as someone carrying a weight the rest of us could not fully comprehend, a weight built from a history of conflict longer and harder than anything most Alliance species had ever experienced, and I found myself wondering, for the first time, what it would mean to actually understand that weight, rather than simply observing it from a careful distance. I did not yet know that my chance to understand it would come far sooner than I expected, and in circumstances far more dangerous than a maintenance shaft and a contained power failure. 3 months after the incident aboard the Calder's Hope, the Academy selected a small group of senior cadets for an advanced observation assignment, a chance to accompany active-duty crews on routine patrol missions near the Outer Alliance border. I had not expected to be chosen. My performance throughout the program had been steady but unremarkable, certainly nothing compared to the reputation Dale had quietly built for himself since the maintenance shaft incident. When my name appeared on the selection list alongside his, Pell's, and 4 other cadets from our class, I assumed at first that some clerical mistake had been made. "You earned it," Dale told me when I mentioned my surprise during our transport briefing. "You kept your head down that corridor. You didn't freeze. That matters more than people think." The assignment placed us aboard a patrol vessel called the Auric Dawn, a mid-sized cruiser tasked with monitoring a stretch of contested border space where Alliance territory met the edge of an unclaimed system still being surveyed for potential threats. The posting was considered low risk, more educational than dangerous, the kind of mission meant to expose cadets to real operational rhythm without placing us in any genuine danger. That assumption lasted exactly 4 days. We were midway through a routine sensor sweep when the ship's tactical officer, a sharp-eyed Corps woman named Veth Andrian, called an unscheduled alert that pulled every off-duty crew member, cadets included, immediately to their stations. "Unidentified vessel, bearing 27 Mark IV, she announced, her voice clipped and professional, despite the obvious tension underneath it, not matching any registered Alliance signature, approaching at significant velocity. I stood near the back of the bridge alongside the other cadets, close enough to see the main view screen but far enough to stay out of the way of the actual crew, my heart already beating faster than I wanted it to. The unidentified vessel resolved slowly into view, a ship unlike anything I had seen during my training, its hull marked with patterns that meant nothing to me but caused the ship's captain, a tall Thaxian named Doran Vesk, to go very still as he studied the readings. "That configuration," he said quietly, "matches historical records of raider vessels operating beyond the old frontier lines. We have not had a confirmed sighting of that class in over a decade." The bridge fell into a tense, focused silence as crew members moved through their stations with practiced efficiency, preparing the ship for a confrontation that none of us, cadets least of all, had expected to face during what was supposed to be a simple training assignment. "They are hailing us," Veth reported. "Open the channel," Captain Vesk ordered. The voice that came through the comm system was distorted, deliberately so it seemed, designed to disguise whatever species was speaking on the other end. The message was short, demanding immediate surrender of the vessel and its cargo, with a vague but unmistakable threat attached to any refusal. "We are a training vessel," Captain Vesk responded, his voice steady despite the situation. "We carry no cargo of value to you. I suggest you reconsider this approach." The response came not as words but as action, a weapons lock alert flashing across multiple stations simultaneously, the unidentified vessel's intentions made suddenly and violently clear. "All cadets, clear the bridge immediately," Captain Vesk ordered, his earlier calm now edged with real urgency. "Proceed to designated safe zones." We moved quickly, following the evacuation route we had memorized during our very first day aboard, but we had barely reached the corridor outside the bridge when the entire ship shuddered violently, throwing several of us against the walls as the lights flickered and emergency systems began blaring throughout the vessel. "They are firing on us," Pell said, her voice tight with the same fear I felt building rapidly in my own chest. We continued moving as quickly as the shaking corridors allowed, but a second impact, harder than the first, sent a section of the ceiling ahead of us crashing down in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, blocking our intended path entirely. This was not a simulation. This was not a controlled exercise with instructors monitoring every variable for our safety. This was real, the danger immediate and uncontrolled, and I felt my training threatening to abandon me entirely as raw panic clawed its way up through my chest. "There's a secondary corridor," Dale said immediately, his voice cutting through the chaos with the same steady focus I remembered from the maintenance shaft months earlier. "This way, move." We followed him without question, none of us in any position to argue, trusting the same instinct that had saved us once before to save us again now. The ship continued to shake around us with each new impact, alarms layering over alarms until the noise itself became a kind of physical pressure pressing in from every direction. We reached a secondary safe zone, a reinforced compartment designed to withstand significant structural damage, just as another impact rocked the ship hard enough to throw two of the other cadets off their feet entirely. Inside the compartment, a small emergency display showed a simplified version of the battle unfolding outside, the Auric Dawn's icon flashing yellow as it absorbed damage from the larger, more heavily armed raider vessel bearing down on it. "We are going to lose this fight," one of the other cadets said, his voice barely above a whisper, the kind of statement nobody wants to say out loud, but everyone in the room was already thinking. I expected Dale to offer some kind of reassurance, the same calm confidence he had shown in every previous crisis, but instead his expression had gone unusually serious, his eyes fixed on the small display with an intensity that unsettled me more than the battle itself. "Captain Vesk is fighting defensively," he said quietly, almost to himself, "trying to outlast them instead of trying to win. That's not going to work against a ship with that kind of firepower advantage." "What else can he do?" Pell asked. Dale did not answer immediately, his attention still locked on the display, watching the pattern of the battle with an expression I had never seen on him before, something that looked almost like recognition, as though he were watching something he had studied before, in circumstances none of us could imagine. The ship shuddered again, harder this time, and the lights in our compartment dimmed briefly before stabilizing on backup power. "I need to get to the bridge," Dale said suddenly, already moving toward the compartment's secondary exit. "That is against protocol," I said, grabbing his arm before he could leave. "Cadets are required to remain in designated safe zones during active combat." "I know the protocol," he said, and there was something in his voice now, something hard and certain that I had not heard from him before. "I also know that protocol was written assuming the ship's crew has tactical options they're not currently using." "What options?" Pell demanded. Dale hesitated for just a moment, and in that hesitation, I saw something I had not expected to see from him, a flicker of genuine fear, quickly suppressed, but unmistakably present. "There's a maneuver," he said. "Aggressive, not standard alliance doctrine. Forces a defending ship to commit fully, rather than absorbing damage defensively. It's risky. If it goes wrong, it goes very wrong. But if Captain Vesk keeps fighting the way he's fighting now, this ship doesn't survive the next 10 minutes regardless." "How do you know a maneuver that is not standard alliance doctrine?" I asked, my grip still tight on his arm. His eyes met mine, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to genuine pain behind the usual calm. "Because it's standard human doctrine," he said quietly. "We didn't always have allies to call for help when things got bad. Sometimes the only option was to make the fight too expensive for the other side to finish, even if it meant betting everything on a single move." I released his arm slowly, understanding without needing further explanation exactly what kind of history had produced a tactic like that, the kind of history he had hinted at without ever fully describing during all our previous conversations. "Go," I said. "Tell them. We will explain to anyone who asks afterward." Dale nodded once, sharp and decisive, and disappeared through the compartment's exit before any of the other cadets could object further. The next several minutes passed in a kind of suspended dread, the four of us remaining in the compartment watching the small display as the battle continued, unable to do anything except wait and hope that whatever Dale was attempting to communicate to the bridge crew would actually make a difference. Then, abruptly, the pattern of the battle on the display changed. The Auric Dawn's icon, which had been retreating in a careful defensive pattern, suddenly surged forward instead, closing the distance toward the raider vessel rather than maintaining it. The shift was so sudden, so contrary to everything we had been taught about defensive tactics, that for a moment I thought something had gone catastrophically wrong rather than intentionally changed. "What is happening?" Pell asked, her voice rising with fresh alarm. "I do not know," I admitted, watching the display with a tight knot forming in my chest. The two icons on the display merged briefly, weapons fire crossing between them in a pattern far more aggressive than anything we had seen during the earlier exchanges, and for several agonizing seconds neither ship's status indicator changed in any way that told us who was winning. Then the raider vessel's icon flickered, flashed red, and began retreating rapidly, breaking off the engagement entirely and pulling away at a speed that suggested significant damage had finally been inflicted. A cheer broke out among the other cadets in our compartment, relief flooding through the small space, as the immediate threat clearly began withdrawing, but I found myself unable to fully join in their celebration, my mind still caught on the look I had seen in Dale's eyes before he left the room. It was not until nearly an hour later, once the ship's status had stabilized and crew members began moving through the corridors checking for injuries and damage, that Dale finally returned to where we waited, looking exhausted in a way that went beyond simple physical tiredness. "It worked," he said simply, sitting down heavily on a nearby bench. "Captain Vesk committed to the maneuver. Raider ship took more damage than they expected and broke off." "You saved the ship," I said. He shook his head slowly. "Captain Vesk saved the ship. I just told him about an option he didn't know existed." "Where did you learn it?" I asked, the question I had been holding back for the past hour finally escaping. Truly, not the short version. Dale was quiet for a long moment, staring at his own hands in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Orun Vex during the screening room, months earlier, that same gray, distant look of someone caught between the present moment and something much older. "My grandfather taught it to me," he said finally. "He served during one of the last major conflicts before unification. Said he learned it from soldiers, who came before him, who learned it from soldiers before that. It's not written down in any official manual. It's the kind of thing that gets passed down, because writing it down somewhere people could study it in safety feels almost disrespectful to what it actually cost to learn the first time." I did not fully understand what he meant by that, not completely, but I understood enough to recognize that the calm I had first noticed in that screening room months earlier, the steadiness that had unsettled me so deeply when I first witnessed it, was not some simple trait unique to his individual personality. It was something built across generations, passed down through a history longer and harder than anything most of us in that compartment could properly imagine, carried quietly by a person who ate his ration bar through horror because he had already inherited far worse than what any training footage could show him. I sat beside him on the bench, saying nothing for a long while, simply allowing the silence between us to exist without trying to fill it with questions he clearly was not ready to answer. It was the most honest moment we had shared since the day I first sat across from him in the mess hall, and somehow, despite everything that had just happened, it felt more important than the battle itself. The official report on the Auric Dawn incident took nearly 3 weeks to clear review, and during that time, rumors about what had actually happened spread through the academy faster than any official explanation could keep up with. By the time we returned to regular training, half the cadet population seemed to believe Dale had personally taken command of the bridge during the attack, a version of events so exaggerated that even Dale found himself laughing quietly whenever someone repeated it to him directly. "I told the captain about one tactical option," he said to me one evening, shaking his head as another first-year cadet walked away after asking him breathlessly whether the stories were true. "I didn't fly the ship. I didn't fire a single weapon. People love a good story more than they love the boring truth." "The truth is not boring," I said. "The truth is that you recognized a pattern nobody else on that ship recognized, and it saved everyone aboard." He shrugged in the same easy way he always did when faced with anything resembling praise, though I had come to understand by then that the shrug was not indifference. It was simply another way of carrying something heavy without letting it show on the surface. Captain Vesk himself requested a formal meeting with Dale shortly after the official report cleared, an unusual request given the significant difference in their ranks, and Dale returned from that meeting looking thoughtful in a way I had not seen from him before. "What did he want?" I asked. "He wanted to know more about where the maneuver came from," Dale said, "whether there were others like it, whether human tactical history might have things worth studying more formally within Alliance training programs." "What did you tell him?" Dale considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I told him there's a lot we haven't shared yet, some of it because nobody's asked, some of it because it's not exactly comfortable material to teach in a classroom. Will you share more of it now?" "Some of it," he said, "not all at once. Some of what my people carry isn't meant to be handed over easily. It costs too much to learn the first time around." I thought about that conversation often over the following weeks, turning it over in my mind alongside everything else I had learned about Dale, and through him, about humans more broadly, since that first day in the screening room. The Academy, perhaps prompted by Captain Vesk's report, announced a revision to its training curriculum shortly afterward, one that would incorporate select elements of human tactical history into advanced coursework for senior cadets. The announcement caused considerable debate among instructors and students alike, some welcoming the change as overdue recognition of a valuable perspective, others expressing the same wary concern Corin Ash had voiced to me so many months earlier. I was asked, somewhat to my surprise, to assist in compiling cadet feedback for the curriculum review, given my established relationship with Dale and my early observations from the original screening session that had apparently been noted in instructor records without my knowledge. It was during this process that I finally requested a copy of the original screening footage, curious to revisit it now with the additional context I had gained over the months since that first viewing. Watching it again, alone this time in a small review room, rather than surrounded by 60 frightened classmates, I found the footage just as difficult to watch as I remembered. The same collapsing structures, the same desperate voices, the same overwhelming sense of helplessness running through every scene. But this time, I found myself watching it differently, no longer simply absorbing the horror of it, but trying to understand it, the way I imagined Dale might have understood it that first day, as a kind of historical record rather than a fresh and unprecedented horror. I requested, through proper channels, access to a small selection of human historical records similar to what Dale had described during our earliest conversation, the kind of material he said most humans encountered gradually throughout childhood rather than all at once as adults. What I found confirmed everything Dale had told me, and somehow still managed to surprise me with its scope. Conflicts that spanned not years but decades. Records of loss on a scale that dwarfed anything most other Alliance species had experienced in their own recorded histories. And running through all of it, a persistent thread of survival, adaptation, and a kind of hard-earned competence that no other species in the Alliance had been forced to develop in quite the same way. I began to understand, with a clarity I had not possessed during those first uncertain weeks of training, exactly why Dale had been able to sit through that screening footage without flinching while the rest of us fell apart around him. It was not that the footage failed to affect him. He had told me himself, honestly, that he carried real fear during difficult moments, the kind of fear any reasonable person would feel facing genuine danger. The difference was that his species had been forced, across a long and difficult history, to learn how to function despite that fear, rather than being overwhelmed by it, a skill passed down through generations the way other skills might be passed down in calmer, more stable circumstances. That skill, I came to realize, was not a weakness or a strange deficiency as some cadets had initially assumed. It was perhaps one of the most valuable things humans had brought with them into the Alliance, a hard-won competence that no simulation, no training program, and no amount of careful preparation could fully replicate in species that had not needed to develop it the same way. Near the end of that training cycle, the Academy held a final assessment ceremony for our class, marking the transition from cadet status to active service eligibility for those who had successfully completed the program. Dale stood near the back of the assembly hall during the ceremony, the same position he had occupied during that very first screening months earlier, though the atmosphere around him now carried none of the wary distance it once had. Several cadets approached him throughout the evening, no longer driven by curiosity about his strange calm, but by genuine respect for what that calm had repeatedly proven capable of producing under pressure. Even Corin Ash, whose early skepticism had been some of the sharpest in our class, sought him out near the end of the ceremony. "I owe you an apology," Corin said, his plated skin shifting slightly with what I had come to recognize as discomfort. "I doubted whether someone like you belonged in combat roles. I was wrong." "You weren't entirely wrong to ask the question," Dale said, surprising me with his response. "Fear that doesn't show isn't the same as fear that doesn't exist. You were right to want to know the difference before trusting someone with your life." Corin seemed unsure how to respond to this, eventually settling on a simple nod before moving away to rejoin the rest of the gathering. I found Dale alone briefly near the end of the evening, standing near a window that looked out over the Academy grounds, the same quiet stillness about him that I had first mistaken for indifference all those months earlier. "Do you remember what I asked you?" I said, joining him by the window, "that first day in the mess hall? You asked if I was afraid," he said, without needing to think about it. "And do you remember what you told me?" "I told you fear wasn't the right word for what I was doing, that I was cataloging instead." "I think I finally understand what you meant," I said. "It took me most of this entire training cycle, but I think I finally understand it." He turned to look at me properly for the first time during that conversation, something gentle in his expression that I had not often seen from him. What do you understand? That carrying fear quietly is not the same as not having it, I said. That what looked like calm in that screening room was actually the heaviest kind of strength, built from a history none of the rest of us had to live through ourselves, and that the rest of us were wrong to assume calm meant empty, when really it meant full of something we simply could not see from the outside. Dale was quiet for a moment, looking back out toward the academy grounds, the lights of the training yards visible in the distance beyond the glass. That's about as close as anyone's gotten, he said finally. Most people stop at fearless. You went further than that. Will you tell me more? I asked. About where it comes from, about your grandfather, about everything you have not shared yet. He considered the question with the same careful weight he brought to everything important, and for a long moment I thought he might decline, the way he had declined so many similar requests throughout our training together. Instead, he offered a small, tired smile, the kind that carried both exhaustion and something close to relief in equal measure. Yeah, he said, I think I will. Not all of it tonight, but I think you've earned more than the short version now. We stood together by that window for a long while after that, neither of us speaking further, simply watching the academy grounds settle into evening quiet around us. Two cadets from entirely different worlds who had somehow found, across one strange and difficult training cycle, a kind of understanding neither of us had expected to discover when this had all begun. I thought back, one final time, to that very first day, to the screening room, to the wrapper folded neatly into a small square while the rest of us fell apart around him. I no longer saw that moment as strange, or unsettling, or difficult to explain. I saw it instead for exactly what it had always been, a small and quiet act performed by someone who had already learned, long before any of us ever met him, exactly how much a person could carry without ever needing to let it show. And in the months and years of service that followed, as I came to know more of Dale's history and more of the long, difficult road his people had traveled to arrive among the stars alongside the rest of us, I never again mistook that particular kind of calm for anything less than what it truly was. It was not the absence of fear at all. It was simply fear that had learned, through a harder path than most of us would ever have to walk ourselves, exactly how to keep moving forward anyway.